I took the salvage contract because the money was unreal and the questions were minimal, and at that point in my life that felt like mercy. I had been drifting from job to job, underwater construction, inspection dives, anything that kept me submerged and away from people. The email came without warning, a clean subject line, no logo, just an attached contract and a single sentence telling me to read carefully. The numbers at the bottom made my hands shake. I reread them 3 times, certain there had to be a mistake. Deep ocean salvage always paid well, but this was different. This was enough to erase debt, enough to make the future feel less narrow. It should have raised alarms immediately. Instead, I printed the contract and sat at my kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator while I read every line like it might disappear if I blinked. The first pages were familiar: depth ratings, equipment responsibilities, medical waivers that acknowledged pressure sickness, nitrogen narcosis, equipment failure, standard language for people who worked where mistakes were fatal. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. Liability clauses gave way to behavioral clauses, not safety procedures but expectations. Compliance. Silence. Entire paragraphs were dedicated to what I was not allowed to discuss, record, or speculate about. It felt less like a job agreement and more like something written by people who expected problems. Certain depths were highlighted in bold, not as limits but as thresholds. Past those numbers, the language changed again. No personal recording devices, no independent documentation, no verbal descriptions over open channels. I paused there, tapping the page with my finger, trying to remember if I had ever seen restrictions like that before. I had not. By the time I reached the final page, my excitement had thinned into something tighter and colder. The last clause was separated from the rest by a full inch of blank space, like the author wanted it to stand alone. It was written in plain language, no legal padding, no soft phrasing. It read like a warning someone insisted on leaving behind. It referenced something called the drowned giant. There was no definition, no explanation, just a single paragraph stating that any acknowledgement of the drowned giant, verbal or otherwise, during operations would result in immediate termination of contract and permanent exclusion from future work. The word acknowledgement was underlined. Not contact, not interference, acknowledgement. I laughed once out loud in my empty kitchen. It was a reflex, the way people laugh when something almost makes sense but not quite. I told myself it was an internal code name, a piece of corporate theater meant to discourage divers from inventing stories in the dark. Salvage crews were superstitious. Everyone knew that. The deeper you went, the more your brain tried to fill the silence with shapes and meaning. Still, I reread that paragraph more times than I cared to admit. I signed the contract the next morning. The support vessel was waiting 3 days later at a port that barely appeared on maps. It was old but meticulously maintained, all sharp angles and muted colors, like it had been designed not to draw attention. The crew did not introduce themselves the way crews usually did. Names were exchanged, but nothing else. No jokes, no casual testing of personalities. Everyone moved with quiet efficiency, eyes forward, voices low. I noticed immediately that nobody asked why I was there. They already knew, or they did not care. The captain met me on deck and handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a laminated card printed with rules, not safety protocols. Rules. They were numbered, concise, and absolute. Most of them were unsettling but manageable. Abort dives without explanation. Do not pursue unidentified sonar returns. If equipment registers mass beyond expected parameters, disengage immediately. The last rule was not numbered. It read, "If the drowned giant is present, you are not." I stood there longer than necessary, the salt air cold in my lungs, and waited for the captain to explain it. He did not. He simply watched me with the kind of patience that comes from experience, not kindness. That night in my assigned bunk, the hum of the ship replaced the refrigerator noise I was used to. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the words in my head. Drowned giant. Present. Acknowledgement. The terms felt deliberately vague, like they were designed to slide around whatever truth they were hiding. I told myself the same thing again. Corporate myth. A control mechanism. Something to keep divers from pushing boundaries. I had seen worse psychological tactics used to manage risk. But as the ship pulled away from port and the water beneath us deepened into something darker and more endless, I realized something else had been written into that contract, something not spelled out in ink. They were not afraid of liability. They were afraid of attention. And whatever the drowned giant was, it was something they had already learned to fear. The rules were not explained during daylight. That should have been my first real warning. They waited until the ship had settled into its night rhythm, engines steady, deck lights dimmed, most of the crew either asleep or pretending to be. I was told to meet in the galley just after midnight. No reason given, no urgency in the message, just an expectation that I would come. The galley felt smaller at night. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above stainless steel surfaces that reflected just enough to make the room feel watched. 4 people were already there when I arrived. The captain, the dive supervisor, a technician I had barely spoken to, and an older diver whose posture alone told me he had been doing this longer than most people survived it. No one sat down. The captain closed the door behind me and, without preamble, said this was not a briefing. It was a correction. Everything I had read in the contract was incomplete by design. The written rules were the ones the company could admit to. The real rules were passed down verbally because writing them down made them too easy to question. He started listing them slowly, not looking at me, like he was reciting something memorized a long time ago. No cameras past a certain depth. The number was lower than I expected. Below it, all visual documentation was restricted to live feeds monitored topside and wiped immediately after ascent. No exceptions. If a camera failed and recorded anyway, the dive was scrubbed and the diver was reassigned or removed entirely. No touching anything that looked biological but did not match existing marine records. Not samples, not tests, not even incidental contact. If it looked like it might once have been alive and science did not already have a name for it, we were to back away slowly and leave it undisturbed. No verbal descriptions of large silhouettes over comms. This one came with a pause. The older diver finally looked at me then, eyes steady, unreadable. If sonar or visibility revealed something too large to classify quickly, we were to report equipment malfunction, nothing else. Describing shape, movement, or scale was prohibited. Words carried weight, he said. Some things reacted to being described. I almost laughed at that, almost. Then came the final rule, spoken more quietly than the rest. Never acknowledge the drowned giant if it appeared. Not see, not encounter, acknowledge. I asked what acknowledgement meant in this context, and the room changed instantly. The technician shifted his weight. The dive supervisor crossed his arms tighter. The captain exhaled slowly through his nose, like he was deciding how much damage honesty would cause. Acknowledgement, he said, meant any recognition that implied awareness. Staring too long, tracking movement, naming it even internally, adjusting course because of it rather than because of protocol. The giant did not need to be touched or spoken to. It only needed to be noticed. The older diver finally spoke. His voice was rough, like it had been sanded down over years of breathing compressed air. He said the ocean was full of things that did not belong where they were. Most of them were passive. Some of them were sleeping. The drowned giant was neither. They told me the tone mattered because fear was not useful down there. Panic killed divers faster than pressure. The rules were not meant to scare us. They were meant to keep us invisible. I asked the question anyway. What happens if someone breaks a rule? No one answered right away. The captain eventually said that contracts ended. Careers ended. Sometimes divees ended early. Sometimes people did not come back at all. He did not elaborate, and no one pressed him to. The silence after that felt deliberate, like they were giving me space to understand without forcing me to hear details I could not unhear. I realized then that none of them were treating this like superstition. There was no nervous humor, no eye rolling. They spoke the way people talk about storms they have lived through or graves they have visited more than once, with respect, with caution, with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing the rules exist because someone paid for their absence. When the meeting ended, I was dismissed without ceremony. No one asked if I had questions. No one reminded me of consequences. They trusted that the weight of what had been said would settle on its own. Back in my bunk, I lay awake listening to the slow, constant sound of water against steel. The rules replayed themselves in my head, each one looping back to the same unspoken idea. This was not about safety alone. It was about containment, about minimizing interaction, about pretending that something enormous and wrong could be managed simply by refusing to acknowledge it. I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a giant that could drown, tried to imagine something so out of place that the ocean itself acted as its restraint. The thought followed me into sleep, heavy and unresolved. The next morning, when the first dive schedule was posted, I noticed something else. No one had written the drowned giant's name anywhere. But everyone knew exactly where not to go. My early dives looked exactly like what I had trained for. Containers stacked like tombstones on the seafloor. Cargo holds split open by pressure and years of corrosion. Sections of rigging drifting gently in currents that never quite touch the bottom. The abyss has a way of making human engineering look temporary, and at first there was comfort in that familiarity. I knew how steel failed under depth. I knew how storms rearranged wreckage. I knew how time erased intent. The first few weeks passed without incident. I descended, worked, ascended. The routine was almost meditative. The deeper you go, the quieter the world becomes. Sound compresses into vibration. Color drains until everything exists in shades of blue and black. Your breathing becomes the loudest thing you know, a constant reminder that you do not belong there. But with every new assignment, the depth increased. At first, the changes were subtle. A shipping container crushed inward instead of collapsed from above. Support beams bent in smooth curves rather than jagged breaks. I chalked it up to unusual pressure differentials, odd angles of descent. The ocean is complex, and nothing down there is truly predictable. Then we reached a wreck that did not make sense. It was a cargo vessel lost decades earlier, supposedly torn apart by a storm. The storm explanation failed the moment my lights swept across the hull. There were no signs of surface impact damage, no debris field consistent with wave action. Instead, the hull looked peeled open from below, steel plates bent outward like something had pushed its way up through the ship. I reported it clinically, keeping my language careful. Unusual deformation, possible structural failure unrelated to collision. The surface team acknowledged and told me to continue. As I moved deeper around the wreck, the damage became worse. Entire sections of the ship were missing, not scattered, not broken apart, just gone. The edges were smooth in places, warped in others, like metal that had been softened and reshaped rather than torn. I remember hovering there longer than necessary, my lights tracing the curve of a beam that looked pinched, almost squeezed. It reminded me of something organic, muscle under tension. I pushed the thought away immediately. Rules did not allow that kind of thinking. On later dives, similar patterns appeared again and again. Planes folded in half without impact marks. Oil rig components twisted into shapes that looked deliberate. I began to notice how often wrecks leaned in the same direction, how debris fields clustered as if drawn by a subtle force. Sonar returns started acting strangely too. At certain depths, wide shapes would appear at the edge of the display, not sharp enough to identify, not stable enough to track. When I adjusted angle or light, they vanished. Equipment error was the official explanation, but the errors always followed the same pattern. Large, slow, just outside the range of clear focus. The first time I mentioned it casually over dinner, the conversation stopped. Forks paused midair. Someone cleared their throat and asked about tomorrow's dive schedule. The topic shifted so cleanly it felt rehearsed. I tried again later, framing it as a technical concern. Calibration issues, sonar interference. The dive supervisor nodded, made a note, and never followed up. After that, I stopped bringing it up at all. Down there, isolation plays tricks on you. Your brain looks for patterns because it hates randomness. I reminded myself of that often. But the longer I worked in the abyss, the more consistent those patterns became. Damage that suggested compression rather than collapse. Wrecks arranged like offerings rather than accidents. Silence that felt intentional. There was also the water itself. At certain depths, it felt thicker. Not in a way instruments could measure, but in the way my movement slowed just slightly, like I was pushing through resistance that should not exist. My suit compensated automatically, but my body noticed. My breathing changed. My pulse crept up without obvious cause. Once, while recovering a section of antenna from a downed research platform, my lights caught something pale beneath the silt. Just a curve, barely visible before sediment shifted and covered it again. I froze, heart hammering, then forced myself to move on. Pale rock, mineral deposit, anything but what my instincts suggested. When I surfaced, my hands shook long after the suit was off. The crew never spoke about fear openly, but it showed in smaller ways. Dives ended early without explanation. Coordinates were adjusted slightly between briefings. A wreck that should have taken days to clear was suddenly declared unrecoverable and abandoned. I began to understand that salvage was not about retrieving value. It was about control, about managing where human attention went, about keeping certain areas quiet. By the end of the month, I had seen enough bent steel and impossible damage to know something was wrong. Not broken equipment, not natural forces, something else. Something that left fingerprints on everything it touched without ever fully revealing itself. And every time I started to think too hard about what that something might be, I remembered the rules spoken in the galley at midnight. No descriptions, no acknowledgement, especially not of large silhouettes. So I did my job. I kept my reports clean. I followed instructions precisely. I told myself that whatever lived in the abyss did not concern me. But the abyss does not stay abstract forever. It waits, and it remembers. The first rule I broke did not feel like rebellion. It felt like curiosity stretched just a little too far, the kind that sneaks up on you after repetition dulls caution. By my fourth week, the abyss had started to feel familiar. Dangerous, yes, but knowable. Predictable in its own hostile way. That false confidence is what nearly got me killed. The dive was supposed to be routine, a partial recovery of industrial equipment lost during a failed survey decades earlier. The coordinates were clean, the depth within my certified range, the schedule tight but reasonable. I descended with the steady rhythm I had learned to trust, monitoring pressure, temperature, oxygen, letting my body settle into the silence. About 20 minutes in, the sonar flickered. At first it looked like interference, a soft bloom on the edge of the display, wide and indistinct. I adjusted the angle, expecting it to break apart into static or resolve into scattered debris. Instead, it smoothed out. The shape did not sharpen, but it stabilized. Massive, rounded, slow-moving. It should not have existed. Debris fields show chaos, sharp angles, erratic returns. This was uniform, like a shadow passing behind frosted glass. I felt my pulse pick up as I told myself what I always did. Equipment error, thermal layering, a glitch caused by depth and pressure interacting in unpredictable ways. The rule said to report unidentified sonar returns immediately. I did not. I hovered there, hands steady on the controls, watching the shape drift just outside my direct line of sight. It moved with intention, not current. I told myself that was projection. The brain looks for agency when it is bored or afraid. I was both. I stayed down longer than approved, pretending to recalibrate my instruments while I watched that slow, impossible mass slide across my display. Each second stretched, heavy and electric. I waited for something to happen, for alarms, for a call from the surface, for the shape to resolve into something ordinary. None of that happened. Eventually, the sonar bloom faded, dissolving into nothing as smoothly as it had appeared. The display returned to normal, as if it had never registered anything at all. Relief washed through me, sharp and dizzying. I logged the recalibration, initiated ascent, and told myself I had imagined the entire thing. As I rose, the water grew marginally lighter, my rig lights pushing further into the dark. I focused on my breathing, on the numbers scrolling past, on the familiar discomfort of changing pressure. That was when my lights brushed across something far below. It was not close. It was distant, barely within range. But it was pale in a way that nothing down there should be, not reflective like metal, not granular like rock, smooth, curved, and wrong. I slowed my ascent without meaning to. The beam slid across it for less than a second, just long enough for my brain to register shape without understanding scale. A surface that curved away beyond the reach of light. A suggestion of contour that felt anatomical rather than geological. I stared. The rule said never acknowledge the drowned giant if it appeared. I did not speak. I did not change course. I did not name it. But I looked, and I kept looking longer than any safe protocol would allow. In that moment, attention felt like gravity, like something pulling me downward, demanding focus. Nothing happened. No alarms, no movement, no sudden change in pressure or current. The pale shape did not shift or react. It remained exactly as it was, silent and distant, while my rig continued its slow ascent. That was the worst part. If something had lunged, if the water had moved wrong, if my instruments had failed, any of that would have made sense. Instead, the ocean accepted my mistake without comment. The lights moved on. Darkness swallowed the pale curve. The ascent continued. By the time I reached the surface, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the ladder with both of them just to climb out. The deck crew noticed, of course. They always did, but no one asked questions. They never did unless you invited them. In the debrief, I reported nothing unusual. Standard recovery, minor recalibration, no anomalies. My voice sounded steady even to my own ears, which almost frightened me more than the dive itself. That night, lying in my bunk, I replayed the image over and over. Pale surface, impossible scale, the way it had existed without needing to move. I told myself it could have been anything, a mineral formation, an optical illusion, light scattering in deep water. But every explanation failed the same test. It had felt watched. Not in the way people imagine monsters watching, with intent or hunger. It felt more like proximity, like standing too close to something vast and indifferent, something that did not need to act to assert its presence. I had broken the rule, and the ocean had not punished me for it. Instead, it had let me go. That realization settled into my chest and stayed there, heavy and cold. Because whatever allowed me to leave that depth without consequence had made a choice. And I did not know why. The assignment came through with a classification tag I had not seen before. No company header, no salvage code, just coordinates, depth range, and a single directive marked priority. The location sat along an old shipping lane that had quietly fallen out of use over the years. Officially, it was due to weather and cost. Unofficially, everyone knew ships vanished there more often than statistics could comfortably explain. The wreck itself was supposed to be straightforward. A freighter lost decades ago, last transmission garbled, no distress call logged. Insurance wrote it off. We were there to recover navigational equipment and anything identifiable enough to close the file permanently. I remember the descent feeling heavier than usual, like the water resisted me more with every meter. My instruments read normal. Pressure curves matched expectations. But my body felt wrong, like I was sinking into something thicker than seawater. When the wreck came into view, it looked almost intact from above. The hull rested at a slight angle, bow tilted downward, stern elevated just enough to expose torn metal and collapsed decking. There was no debris field scattered outward. Everything clustered close, as if the ship had been lowered gently rather than destroyed. As I circled it, the first thing that struck me was how still it was. Even at depth, there is usually some movement. Sediment drifting, currents brushing surfaces. Here, the water felt suspended, like the wreck existed inside a pocket where motion hesitated. Then my lights dipped below the hull. At first, I thought I was seeing the seabed, a smooth rise of silt and stone pressed up against the underside of the ship. But as I adjusted my angle, the shape beneath resolved into something else. It was too rounded, too continuous. The wreck was not resting on the seafloor. It was resting on something embedded within it. The shape dwarfed the freighter. I could not see its full outline. The limits of my lights cut off long before any edge appeared. What I could see were curves that suggested mass and structure, broad surfaces that arced away smoothly, contours that felt deliberate rather than accidental. This was not a rock formation. It was not a reef. It was something that had volume in a way geology rarely does. I tried to catalog it clinically. I told myself to think in terms of shapes and measurements, radius, angle, coverage, but my brain kept supplying other words: shoulder, rib, back. The wreck itself looked wrong once I noticed that. Its hull plates were bent inward, not from collapse, but from pressure applied unevenly. The ship appeared to be anchored to whatever lay beneath, metal folded and wrapped as if molded around the shape below it. Cables and debris draped downward, clinging instead of falling. I hovered there, careful to keep my position stable, and felt my breathing grow shallow. The rule about biological anomalies pressed hard against my thoughts. I was not touching anything. I was not sampling. I was only observing. Observation felt dangerous. When my lights passed slowly over the exposed surface beneath the wreck, the water around me vibrated. Not violently, not enough to register as a current. Just a subtle tremor, like a distant shift transmitted through something solid. The silt lifted in a thin cloud and settled again almost immediately. It felt like something had adjusted its weight. My instruments flickered, not alarms, just momentary lag, as if readings hesitated before correcting themselves. Depth, orientation, all normal after the pause. My body, however, reacted before my mind could catch up. A spike of adrenaline, muscles tightening against restraints. I pulled back instinctively, increasing distance between myself and the wreck. The vibration did not repeat. The shape did not move further. The water returned to its unnatural stillness. I reported partial visual obstruction beneath the hull. I did not describe scale. I did not speculate. My words stayed technical and thin, stripped of anything that might count as acknowledgement. The surface team responded immediately, ordering me to mark the wreck and abort detailed recovery. As I backed away, I kept my lights angled carefully upward, refusing to let them sweep across the shape again. It took effort. Curiosity fought me every second, a physical pull toward understanding. I had to remind myself that some answers cost more than they give. During ascent, I felt it again. That sensation of proximity, not pursuit, not attention, just presence. Like being too close to a sleeping animal large enough that its breathing changed the environment around it. Back on deck, the crew moved faster than usual. Equipment was stowed without comment. No debrief questions beyond confirmation of compliance. The wreck was logged as unstable. Recovery canceled. Coordinates flagged. Later, alone in my bunk, I tried to reconstruct what I had seen using logic instead of fear. Geological anomaly, buried formation, coincidental alignment. Every explanation felt thin and temporary, like a patch over something that would not stay covered. What haunted me most was not the size of the shape. It was the way the ship had been drawn to it, anchored, held, as if the wreck was not an accident but a consequence. I understood then why certain areas of the ocean accumulated wrecks without clear cause, why salvage work existed not to recover value, but to erase patterns, to keep people from noticing that ships did not just sink there. They gathered, and whatever lay beneath that wreck did not need to reach upward to pull them down. It only needed to be there. It was the older diver who finally broke the silence, though I did not realize at first that that was what he was doing. He sat across from me in the mess late one night, long after dinner trays had been cleared and the ship had settled into its low, constant groan. He had been on rotation longer than anyone else I had met on board. Years, maybe decades. The kind of tenure that only happened if you learned exactly when to stop asking questions. He did not start with the giant. He started by asking how I was sleeping. The question caught me off guard. I told him the truth, or a version of it. That sleep came in fragments, that my dreams felt heavy, that I woke up with pressure in my chest like I was still descending. He nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something for him. "You saw it," he said, not accusing, not curious, just stating a fact. I froze. My first instinct was to deny it, to retreat into protocol and careful language. He lifted a hand slightly, stopping me before I spoke. "You don't have to say what," he continued, "or where, or how long you looked. Just tell me if you understand why the rule exists." I did not fully. I said that much. I told him I knew it was dangerous, that it was something the company wanted kept quiet, that we were supposed to pretend it did not exist. He exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward the dark window where the ocean pressed close against steel. "It's not about pretending," he said. "It's about keeping it where it is." That was the first time anyone had spoken about it like a problem that could move. He told me then why it was called drowned, not as a metaphor, not as a story, as a description. The giant was not dead, he said. Dead things decayed, collapsed, became part of the environment. This thing persisted. It endured. It existed in a state that biology did not account for. It had mass and form, but not in a way that fit the rules of living creatures. "It's drowned because it's being held under," he explained. "Not by chains, not by rock, by pressure, by depth, by the ocean itself." The ocean was not its home. That was the part that unsettled me most. Everything else down there belonged in some way. Fish, bacteria, wreckage, even decay had a role. But the giant existed where it should not. The water was not nurturing it. It was restraining it. He described it like a wrongness embedded in the seabed, something that had fallen or been forced into the depths long before humans ever sailed above it. It could not rise on its own, not fully. Not while the weight of the ocean pressed down on it with enough force to keep it inert. Depth was the cage. "Pressure does what gravity does up here," he said. "It keeps things where they belong, or where they're stuck." I asked how long it had been there. He shook his head. "Longer than records, longer than we've been measuring the ocean properly. We only noticed it when ships started disappearing without explanation." That was when salvage entered the picture. Salvage operations were not about recovery in the way I had been taught. They were a response, a containment strategy. Human activity disturbed the water, drilling, shipping lanes, sonar. All of it created vibration and attention. The giant responded to that disturbance not by moving freely, but by shifting subtly, pressing upward against whatever lay above it. Wrecks were not random. They were collisions between human machinery and something immense that could not move away. Every ship we recovered was one that had drifted too close. Every piece of equipment pulled from the seafloor reduced the chance that more would follow. Salvage erased evidence and reduced noise. It kept curiosity at bay. "You keep the surface clean," he said. "You keep the deep quiet, that's the job." I asked what happened when the giant shifted. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he traced a slow circle on the table with his finger, as if outlining something vast and unseen. "Pressure isn't constant forever," he said. "Currents change, temperatures change, the ocean isn't static, and neither is it." The rules existed because attention mattered, sound mattered, recognition mattered. The giant was not mindless, but it was not awake in the way we understood either. It responded to disturbance the way a body responds to irritation, slowly, inevitably. Acknowledgement, he said, was a form of disturbance. Awareness directed at it was like tapping on glass from the inside. That was why we did not describe it, why we did not name it beyond what was necessary, why we treated it like a condition rather than an entity. I asked him what would happen if it ever reached a depth where pressure no longer held it. He finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw something like fear break through his calm. "The ocean would stop being a barrier," he said. "It would become a path." He finished his drink and stood, conversation clearly over. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, not reassuring. "You didn't break the rule by seeing it," he said quietly. "You break it when you start thinking the ocean belongs to us more than it belongs to what's trapped beneath it." That night, I lay awake listening to the hull creak and groan as pressure shifted around us. For the first time since joining the crew, I understood that depth was not just distance from the surface. It was the only thing keeping something enormous from realizing it was no longer alone. The descent that day began without tension. It was scheduled as a short inspection, nothing near the classified zones, nothing that should have stirred anxiety. I remember feeling almost relieved as I sealed into the rig, the familiar weight settling around me like armor. Routine dives were a gift after weeks of unease. They reminded you that the ocean could still behave like an environment instead of a presence. For the first 10 minutes, everything was normal. The water cooled gradually. Pressure increased in smooth increments. My instruments updated cleanly. The seafloor was still far below, invisible beyond the reach of light. I focused on the rhythm of breathing, on keeping my movements efficient and precise. Then the current shifted. Not slowly, not gradually the way currents usually do. It changed direction all at once, like someone had reached down and turned it. My body felt it before my instruments registered anything. A sideways pull that made no sense at that depth, followed by a sudden stillness that felt artificial. Silt rose from the seafloor below in thin spirals, lifting upward instead of dispersing. The particles did not drift randomly. They moved in slow, deliberate curls, climbing through the water column as if gravity had lost its authority. I watched them for several seconds, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew. My instruments lagged. Depth readings froze, then updated in small jumps. Orientation indicators stuttered, correcting themselves repeatedly like they were adjusting for an external variable they could not name. Pressure readings spiked, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make my chest tighten inside the suit. I hovered in place, hands steady, fighting the instinct to ascend immediately. Panic was dangerous. Overreaction was dangerous. The rules demanded calm first, retreat second. The drowned giant did not appear. There was no pale surface, no silhouette, no impossible mass looming just beyond visibility, but everything around me behaved as if it were close. The water felt crowded, compressed in a way that had nothing to do with depth. Sound carried differently. My own breathing echoed back at me with a delay that made my skin prickle. It felt like standing next to something enormous in the dark, and knowing it was there without needing to see it. I checked my surroundings with careful, limited sweeps of light, keeping my movements controlled. The beams cut through the water and came back empty. No wreckage, no formations, just open space and rising silt that refused to settle. That was when I realized the water itself was moving wrong. Currents do not spiral upward in closed systems. Pressure does not fluctuate without cause. Instruments do not hesitate unless something interferes with their reference points. Everything I had trained for relied on predictable physics. Down there, those rules were being bent. I reported the anomaly using the most neutral language I could manage: unusual current behavior, instrument lag, visual disturbance in particulate matter. I avoided descriptors that might imply scale or intent. I did not mention how the water felt. The response from the surface team was immediate. Abort dive, ascend now, do not investigate further. No follow-up questions, no request for clarification, no troubleshooting, just a clean, firm command delivered without hesitation. I obeyed. As I began my ascent, the spiraling silt slowed, then fell back toward the seafloor in an orderly way, as if some invisible pressure had been released. My instruments stabilized. Readings returned to normal. The water resumed behaving like water. The transition was so sudden it left me dizzy. By the time I reached the surface, my heart was pounding hard enough that the deck crew noticed before I spoke. They helped me out of the rig faster than usual, movements efficient but tight. Nobody joked. Nobody asked what I had seen. In the debrief, the dive supervisor marked the incident as environmental anomaly and closed the report. That was it. No investigation, no equipment checks, no recalibration scheduled. I realized then that they already knew what it meant. The older diver caught my eye briefly across the room. He did not nod. He did not shake his head. He simply looked at me with the expression of someone who had seen this moment before and wished it had not happened again. That night the ship altered course slightly. Not enough to justify an announcement, but enough that I felt the change in vibration beneath my feet. The dive schedule was adjusted. Certain depths were removed entirely. Areas that had been greenlit the day before were suddenly off limits. The ocean outside our hull was calm, deceptively so. Moonlight stretched across its surface, broken only by the ship's slow passage. From above, nothing looked wrong. That was always the problem. The surface never showed what was happening below. Lying in my bunk, I replayed the sensation of the water resisting gravity, of instruments compensating for something they could not define, of proximity without presence. The drowned giant had not appeared, but it had not needed to. Its influence alone was enough to bend the environment around it, enough to announce itself without ever breaking the rules. I understood then that sightings were not the real warning sign. Movement was. If the water itself reacted, it meant the pressure holding it down had shifted, even slightly. And if that pressure could change once, it could change again. The rules existed to keep us from noticing those moments too clearly, to prevent us from connecting patterns, to stop us from realizing that the ocean was not just deep. It was strained, and something immense was testing the limits of what held it in place. The recording came to me the way secrets usually do on that ship, quietly and out of sequence. The technician caught me alone in the equipment bay just before dawn, when most of the crew slept and the ship's systems ran on their lowest settings. He did not say my name. He simply gestured for me to follow and led me into a narrow compartment I had never seen used. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old electronics and salt. He shut the door and powered up a terminal that was not connected to the main network. I noticed that immediately. Nothing on that vessel existed without oversight unless someone wanted it that way. He did not explain why he was showing me the file. He did not need to. His hands shook slightly as he loaded it, and that told me everything I needed to know. The footage came from a drone that had been declared lost years earlier. Mechanical failure during a deep survey. That was the official report. The drone was written off, its data supposedly unrecoverable. What I was about to see had never been archived. It did not exist in any system that mattered. The video started mid-descent. The image quality was poor, distorted by depth and age, but the scale was unmistakable. The drone's lights cut through darkness and revealed seabed that did not look like seabed. It was uneven in a way that felt wrong, rising and falling too smoothly. The camera adjusted automatically, trying to resolve focus. Then the shape emerged. It was beneath the seabed, partially exposed, as if the earth itself had failed to keep it buried. The form was enormous, extending beyond the frame in every direction. I could not see its edges, only portions. A curved surface that suggested a torso. Massive depressions that might have been joints or cavities worn smooth by pressure. Around it, structures had accumulated. Wreckage was embedded into the surrounding silt, not scattered randomly, but arranged like scaffolding. Ship hull fragments, rig components, sections of steel girders and antennae, all of it pressed inward, drawn close to the form beneath. It looked less like debris and more like growth, as if the giant had been accruing human artifacts the way reefs accrued coral. Ships had not sunk there by accident. The drone drifted closer, its movements slow and cautious, controlled by someone who already knew they were crossing a boundary. The water around the shape behaved strangely. It flowed in steady, rhythmic patterns, not currents, not turbulence. It moved like breath. In and out. Silt lifted gently with each cycle, then settled again. The timing was too regular to dismiss. I felt my own breathing change as I watched, sinking unconsciously to the motion on screen. The giant itself did not move. That was the most unsettling part. No shifting, no twitching, no reaction to the drone's approach. It remained perfectly still, immense and inert, while the environment around it responded as if it were alive. The technician paused the footage there, fingers hovering over the controls. He looked at me then, eyes hollow, searching my face for something. Permission, understanding, I did not know which. He played the final segment. The drone descended further, passing beneath a jut of wreckage that looked fused to the seabed. Its lights swept across a surface that curved away beyond sight, pale and smooth in a way that made my stomach tighten. The water pulsed again, stronger this time. Instruments on the overlay spiked briefly, then normalized. The footage cut to static before the drone made contact with anything. No crash, no collision, just sudden loss of signal as if the ocean itself had swallowed the transmission. The technician shut the file down immediately after that. He did not replay it. He did not let it linger. They pulled it from the buffer before it wiped, he said quietly. Management never saw it, or if they did, they pretended they didn't. I asked why he was showing me. He hesitated, then shrugged in a way that felt defeated. Because you've seen enough already, he said, and because it's moving. The word settled heavily between us. He explained that the drone footage had been taken years earlier, but recent sonar data matched its location too closely. The shape beneath the seabed had not changed position much, but the surrounding wreckage had increased. More ships, more debris, more evidence of attraction. It was not rising quickly. It did not need to. Every disturbance brought more material closer. Every ship that passed overhead added weight, noise, vibration. Pressure was not just holding it down. It was feeding the conditions that kept it restrained. The technician powered down the terminal and wiped the temporary memory. When he opened the door, the corridor outside looked unchanged, sterile and bright. The ship continued on its course as if nothing had happened. Back in my bunk, the footage replayed behind my eyes. The stillness of the giant, the movement of the water, the scaffolding of wreckage growing slowly around something that should not exist. I understood then why the rules emphasized silence and distance, why salvage mattered, why attention was dangerous. The giant did not need to wake to be a threat. It was already influencing the ocean around it, already shaping patterns, already pulling the world closer, piece by piece. And the recording should not have existed because once you saw it, denial became impossible. You could never look at a sinking ship the same way again. Understanding came to me slowly, the way pressure does. It did not arrive as a revelation so much as a reordering of everything I had already seen. Once the idea took hold, it explained too much to ignore. We were not retrieving lost property. We were erasing symptoms. Every salvage assignment followed the same invisible logic. When sonar picked up a wreck near certain coordinates, it was never treated as a mystery to be solved. There was no curiosity about why it had sunk there, no speculation about storms or mechanical failure. The assumption was immediate and unspoken. Something had drifted too close. The drowned giant had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to rise or move freely, just enough to alter the water around it, enough to pull, enough to disturb. Ships responded to that disturbance the way objects respond to gravity. They leaned toward it. Systems failed subtly. Hulls stressed where they should not. Accidents accumulated around the same invisible center. Salvage was the response. Every wreck we recovered reduced attention. Every piece of debris removed lowered the chance that someone would notice a pattern forming. The work was not about value or closure. It was about maintaining silence, keeping the deep from becoming interesting. The rules existed to preserve the illusion of a normal ocean. I saw it in the way assignments were prioritized. A fishing trawler lost in shallow water could wait months. A research vessel drifting near restricted depths triggered immediate action. The closer a wreck was to certain coordinates, the faster we moved. Not to investigate, but to remove. Noise was the enemy. Sonar sweeps, drilling vibrations, prolonged exploration. All of it created attention, and attention was a form of pressure release. The giant did not respond to curiosity the way animals did. It responded to disturbance like a body reacts to irritation. Salvage reduced that irritation. I started noticing how often equipment was quietly retired after certain dives. Sonar arrays recalibrated to avoid specific frequencies. Routes adjusted to steer traffic away from deep anomalies without explanation. It was subtle, elegant, and deeply dishonest. The ocean presented to the world was a curated one. The giant was not hidden from us. We worked around it every day. It was hidden from everyone else, from scientists who would ask questions, from explorers who would want proof, from corporations that would see opportunity instead of risk. The illusion held because most people did not look down for long. The older diver explained it one night without using names or metaphors. "You don't hide a thing like that," he said. "You make sure no one ever feels the need to look for it." I thought back to the wreck beneath the freighter, the way it had rested on the shape below like an offering, the way wreckage accumulated instead of scattering. None of it was accidental. The giant did not hunt. It did not chase. It waited. Human activity did the rest. I realized then that the rules were not about safety alone. They were about narrative control, about ensuring that any anomalies could be explained away before they formed questions that pointed downward. Do not record, do not describe, do not acknowledge. Acknowledgement created records, records created patterns, patterns led to attention. Salvage removed the physical evidence before the pattern could become obvious. The day after that realization, I was assigned to a recovery that had already been attempted once and aborted without explanation. A research buoy had gone dark near the edge of a restricted zone. When I descended, I found it twisted and partially embedded in the seabed, its anchor cable wrapped around something unseen beneath the silt. I did not need to look far to understand why the first team had pulled out. The water felt wrong again, not violently, just compressed, like the space around me was aware of itself. I completed the recovery quickly, keeping my lights focused upward, refusing to let curiosity drag them lower. When I surfaced, the buoy was gone from the map. Another problem erased. Back on deck, the dive supervisor marked the job complete and moved on to the next task without comment. No discussion of cause, no interest in anomaly. That silence spoke louder than any explanation. It became clear that the company was not reacting to the giant. It was anticipating it, adjusting operations preemptively to keep the environment stable. They tracked shifts in wreck distribution the way meteorologists tracked pressure systems. When salvage activity spiked in a region, it meant something had changed below. The illusion worked because it did not require total secrecy, only enough control to keep the truth fragmented. Divers saw pieces, technicians saw data, supervisors saw patterns. No one saw everything unless they stayed long enough to connect it all. That was the real risk. Long-term exposure created understanding. Understanding led to questions. Questions led to mistakes. I understood then why rotation schedules were strict, why people were quietly reassigned after certain dives, why no one stayed in deep salvage too long unless they learned to stop thinking about what they were protecting the world from. The giant did not need to rise to end the illusion. All it needed was for enough people to notice the same wrongness at the same time. Salvage delayed that moment, bought time, preserved the idea that the ocean was empty beyond what we had cataloged. I began to feel complicit in something far larger than my job description. Every recovery felt like an act of concealment. Every report I sanitized reinforced a lie I could no longer pretend not to see. The drowned giant remained where it was, held down by pressure and distance. But the illusion surrounding it required constant maintenance. And like all systems built on silence, it was fragile. One mistake, one recording that slipped through, one person who refused to look away. I wondered how many errors the system could absorb before the ocean stopped cooperating. And whether, when that happened, salvage would still matter at all. The storm arrived faster than predicted, rolling in from open water with a violence that rattled the hull and turned the deck slick with rain. Waves rose unevenly, driven by conflicting winds that made navigation dangerous even for ships built for it. In the middle of that chaos, a research vessel lost power. It drifted. That alone would have been manageable, but its last known position placed it uncomfortably close to the restricted zone, close enough that alarms triggered quietly in places I was not allowed to see, close enough that the ship altered course despite the weather. There was no time for a full briefing. The captain told me only that I would be going down alone. The vessel needed assessment, hull integrity, structural damage, whether it could be towed without tearing itself apart. Standard language delivered quickly. What was not said mattered more. No recovery team, no additional divers, no logging unless absolutely necessary. This dive would not exist. I sealed into the rig while rain hammered the deck above me, the sound dull and distant once the helmet locked. The ocean below churned with surface violence that masked deeper stillness. I descended through layers of turbulence until the water calmed abruptly, as if the storm had never existed. That contrast unsettled me more than the weather. My lights cut into the dark, revealing the research vessel first. It hovered at an angle, dead in the water, its hull scarred by impact but intact enough to suggest it had not yet reached the bottom. Cables trailed uselessly. Antennae hung bent and silent. Then I angled my lights downward. I saw it immediately. There was no gradual reveal this time, no ambiguous curve or partial glimpse. The seabed fell away beneath the vessel, and there it was, embedded deep into the silt and stone as if the earth itself had grown around it. A massive humanoid shape. It lay on its back, torso partially exposed, limbs disappearing into the seabed beyond visibility. The proportions were unmistakable, shoulders wider than the research vessel above it, a chest broad enough to support wreckage like debris, arms that vanished into the earth like roots. Its head was turned slightly to one side. Eyes closed. The face was scarred not by injury but by time. Pressure had etched lines into it the way wind carved rock. The surface was pale and smooth in places, rough and fissured in others. It did not look decayed. It looked preserved, held in a state that resisted change. I froze. Every rule screamed at me to abort, to turn away, to deny what my eyes were telling me. But the sight anchored me in place. This was not a silhouette, not a suggestion, not a pattern inferred from data. This was the drowned giant. The wreck above it trembled gently, subtle vibrations passing through its hull in slow, rhythmic intervals. Not from the storm, not from current. It was resting its weight against something that moved, just enough to make itself known. Like a sleeping animal breathing beneath a burden, it did not shrug off. The water around me felt dense, compressed, as if the space itself was aware of the mass occupying it. My instruments flickered briefly, then stabilized. They could measure depth and pressure, but they could not account for presence. I should have left. Instead, I hovered there, suspended between protocol and awe. The giant did not move, its chest did not rise, its limbs remained still. But the water flowed around it in that same slow rhythm I had seen in the recording. In and out, subtle, persistent. Breath or something like it. I felt small in a way I never had before. Not insignificant, expendable, like a mote drifting near something that existed on a scale where individual lives blurred into irrelevance. The research vessel above creaked softly as another wave passed overhead. Its hull flexed, metal straining, and for a moment I was certain it would tear free and sink the rest of the way down. If it did, it would not scatter. It would settle. It would join the others. I forced myself to focus on my task. Assessment, damage, risk. I moved carefully around the vessel, keeping my lights angled upward, refusing to let them linger on the giant's face again. Even so, I felt its presence constantly, a gravitational pull on my attention that made every movement feel deliberate and slow. The closer I came to the vessel's underside, the stronger the vibration became. Not violent, just enough to register through the rig, enough to remind me that the thing beneath was not inert in the way rocks were inert. It was held, not ended. I reported minimal hull damage, no immediate breach, towing possible with caution. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, flattened by compression and fear. The surface team acknowledged and ordered immediate ascent. No follow-up questions, no requests for additional data. They did not need it. As I rose, the giant slipped out of view, swallowed by darkness and distance. The water loosened around me, pressure returning to its expected patterns. My instruments steadied completely, as if relieved. When I broke the surface, the storm was still raging, but it felt smaller somehow, insignificant compared to what lay beneath it. The deck crew hauled me up quickly, movements sharp and efficient. No one asked what I had seen. No one mentioned logging the dive. In the debrief that never officially happened, the captain looked at me for a long moment and then simply said the vessel would be towed at first light. The incident was classified as storm-related. End of report. That night I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the giant's face, not threatening, not angry, just present, enduring, buried under a weight it did not fight because it did not need to. I understood then why acknowledgement was forbidden. Seeing it was one thing. Naming it internally, understanding what it was, what it meant, that was another. That was the line you could not cross and still pretend the ocean was empty. The dive was never logged, but it marked me permanently. Because I had seen the thing the rules were built around, and I knew now that it was not waiting to wake. It was waiting to be relieved of the pressure holding it down. I did not plan to go back down so soon after that storm. Nobody said it out loud, but I could feel the ship holding its breath in the days that followed. Routes adjusted again. Dive ease shortened. The older diver avoided my eyes. Something had changed and everyone knew it, even if no one named it. The second descent was framed as routine maintenance. Equipment inspection near the same depth, different coordinates on paper, just far enough from the restricted zone to make it seem reasonable. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself I was being paranoid. That lie did not survive the descent. The water felt wrong almost immediately. Not turbulent, not unstable. Dense, like every meter downward carried more weight than it should. My breathing slowed without instruction, my body responding before my mind caught up. When my lights reached the seafloor, I saw the giant again. It was not closer than before. If anything, it looked exactly the same, embedded, immense, still. The research vessel from the storm was gone, towed away, leaving behind faint scars in the silt where it had rested. I stayed at the edge of visibility, careful not to drift nearer. I told myself I was only there to inspect equipment. I angled my lights away from the giant's face, focusing on a cluster of instruments half buried nearby. That was when it happened. I did not speak. I did not move closer. I did not name it. I followed every rule as precisely as I could. It acknowledged me anyway. One eye opened. Slowly. There was no sudden motion, no dramatic gesture, just a gradual parting of something that had been closed for a very long time. Sediment lifted in a wide arc as the lid shifted, the movement subtle but undeniable, like a tidal change localized around a single point. My instruments reacted instantly. Every readout spiked at once, then flattened, then spiked again. Alarms triggered without sound, warnings flashing silently across my display as systems struggled to compensate for something outside their parameters. The pressure increased. Not enough to crush, not enough to rupture seals. It compressed instead, squeezing the space around me until it felt like the ocean itself had leaned in, curious. My chest tightened. My limbs felt heavy, movement slowed not by resistance but by attention. I froze. The eye was enormous, its surface pale and clouded, not reflective like an animal's but deep in a way that suggested layers. It did not focus the way human eyes focus. It did not track movement. It simply opened, revealing awareness. Something passed over me then. Not a thought, not language, an assessment, ancient and patient and utterly uninterested in my fear. I felt examined the way pressure examines a structure, testing without intent just to see what yields. The rules never said it could not see us. They only said we must never let it know we mattered. In that moment, I understood the difference. Seeing did not equal caring. Awareness did not equal action. The giant did not move because it did not need to. The water around it responded instead, tightening, adjusting, holding everything in place. I felt very small. Not threatened, not targeted, just irrelevant in the presence of something that measured time in spans I could not comprehend. I was a disturbance, nothing more. A temporary irregularity in an environment it had existed within for longer than history recorded. The eye remained open for several seconds. Then it closed. Sediment settled, pressure eased. My instruments stabilized as if nothing had happened. The water loosened around me, returning reluctantly to normal behavior. I did not wait. I initiated ascent immediately, hands steady despite the tremor running through my body. I did not report what had happened. I did not need to. The surface team ordered my return before I could finish the first sentence of my anomaly report. They knew. When I surfaced, the deck crew moved faster than I had ever seen them move. The rig was detached, systems powered down, data buffers wiped without comment. The captain watched the entire process in silence. Later, in a compartment away from the rest of the crew, the older diver sat across from me again. He did not ask what I had seen. He only asked one question. "Did it notice you?" I nodded. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, gaze distant. "That's the risk," he said quietly, not waking it, letting it realize we're here. I asked what happened now. He did not answer directly. Instead, he explained something the rules never addressed. The giant did not need to rise to be dangerous. Awareness changed the balance. Attention altered pressure in ways humans could not measure or predict. "The ocean works because it's heavy," he said, "because it presses down on everything equally. The moment something beneath starts to distinguish what's above it, that balance shifts." I thought about the eye opening, about the way the water had leaned closer, about how easily the environment had responded to that single motion. "What did it see?" I asked. The older diver shook his head. "That's the wrong question," he said. "The right one is whether it will remember." That night the ship changed course again, more dramatically this time. Dive operations were suspended indefinitely. Equipment was secured as if preparing for departure, even though no announcement was made. I lay in my bunk listening to the hull creak and settle, every sound amplified by the knowledge of what lay beneath us. I could still feel the weight of that awareness passing over me, leaving an imprint I could not shake. I had not acknowledged the giant, but it had acknowledged me. And that meant the illusion we worked so hard to maintain had been breached, not by technology or exploration, but by proximity alone. The rules had kept us invisible for a long time. I was no longer sure that was true. I surfaced alive, but survival was not the same as continuation. The moment my boots touched deck, the operation began to change around me in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable and deliberate enough to be unmistakable. Within days, entire coordinates vanished from navigation systems, not flagged, not restricted, gone. Routes that had existed for decades now curved around empty space on digital charts as if the ocean itself had been redrawn. Commercial traffic adjusted automatically, guided by updates that cited efficiency and weather risk. No one questioned it. They rarely did. Ships were rerouted without explanation. Research permits were quietly revoked. Survey projects were delayed indefinitely. Equipment failures were blamed on supply issues that never seemed to resolve. The surface world moved on, unaware that entire sections of the ocean had been effectively erased from consideration. On board, the crew began to thin. People were rotated out quietly, reassigned to shallower operations or land-based roles with vague justifications. No farewells, no announcements, just absence. Bunks emptied overnight, lockers cleared, names removed from schedules as if they had never been there. Those who remained stopped talking about the deep altogether. I was called into a meeting that felt more like an assessment than a promotion. The captain and two representatives I had never seen before sat across from me in a room stripped of anything personal. They spoke calmly, professionally, as if delivering good news. Effective immediately, I would no longer be diving. My experience, they said, made me valuable in an oversight role, monitoring operations, reviewing data, ensuring compliance. It was framed as trust, as recognition of my reliability under pressure. The pay increased, the hours shortened. It was also containment. They understood something had shifted. The giant had noticed a pattern breaking, not a single mistake but accumulation, too many dives, too much attention, too many moments where proximity brushed too close to acknowledgement. The system built to keep it drowned relied on consistency, predictable disturbance, predictable removal. Awareness disrupted that balance. Keeping it drowned now required more than depth. Pressure alone was no longer enough. It required fewer humans nearby, fewer machines generating noise and vibration, fewer mistakes that could draw attention downward. The ocean had to become empty again. From my new position, I saw the scope of what that meant. Budgets reallocated to quietly shut down projects. Data streams filtered more aggressively. Entire classes of sonar returns automatically discarded before human review. It was not censorship in the dramatic sense. It was subtraction. The world above continued to function normally, unaware that its map of the ocean was being simplified for safety. The older diver was reassigned to shore duty not long after. He did not protest. He did not say goodbye. When I asked him later if he was relieved, he only said that some things were easier to bear at a distance. I understood that better than I wanted to. There were nights when I sat alone in the oversight room, watching clean, empty displays where data should have been. The absence felt deliberate, curated. Every blank space represented an area where the ocean was being allowed to remain unknown. The company moved quickly, efficiently. They had done this before. The process was well practiced, like a fire drill no one acknowledged was a fire. I realized then that the cost of keeping the giant drowned was not measured in money or equipment. It was measured in absence, in places people were no longer allowed to look, in questions that never formed because the information needed to ask them had been removed. Human presence had become the variable that needed to be minimized. The illusion of a normal ocean required sacrifice, but not the kind that made headlines. It required quiet adjustments that no one noticed unless they were already looking too closely. I began to feel like a caretaker of a secret too large to hold comfortably. Oversight meant seeing patterns without acting on them, understanding risk without intervening directly, watching as the world reshaped itself subtly to accommodate something it did not know existed. The giant remained where it was, buried and held by pressure. But now there was a new layer of restraint layered above it, human withdrawal, silence enforced by distance rather than rules alone. The company believed this would work. They believed that if enough people left the deep alone, the balance would settle again. That awareness would fade, that the giant would return to its previous state of indifference. I wanted to believe that too. But every time I reviewed data from before the changes, I saw the same slow trend, the same accumulation of wreckage, the same subtle shifts in water behavior. The ocean was not static, neither was the thing trapped beneath it. And the cost of keeping it drowned was rising. I wondered how much absence the world could tolerate before someone noticed the gaps, and whether, when that happened, there would be enough distance left to matter. I left salvage work officially because of stress evaluations. That is what the paperwork says. Prolonged exposure, elevated anxiety markers, recommendation for permanent reassignment, followed by quiet termination when I declined a desk role that would have kept me inside the system. It was clean and polite and designed to end the story without questions. It did not end anything. I still dream of pressure, of cold silence pressing in from every direction. In those dreams, I am not falling or drowning. I am hovering, suspended in water that feels too heavy to move through, listening to my own breathing echo back at me with a delay that tells me I am not alone. I wake up knowing exactly where I am, and still my body takes minutes to accept it. Distance does not erase understanding. If anything, it sharpens it. Away from the routines and the noise of operations, I have had time to think about what we were really doing down there and why it cannot last. Exploration technology keeps improving. Autonomous drones are cheaper now. Private research vessels operate without oversight. Mapping resolution increases every year. Sonar penetrates deeper, renders more detail, filters less aggressively. Curiosity is no longer limited to governments and corporations with something to lose. Individuals with funding and ambition are pushing into depths that were once inaccessible. More eyes are going into the deep. The rules were built for a world where access was rare and expensive, where silence could be maintained through contracts and classifications. That world is ending. The ocean is becoming visible in ways it never was before, and the illusion of emptiness is thinning. The rules are failing, because curiosity always wins eventually. Someone will record what should not be recorded. Someone will describe what should not be described. Someone will notice patterns that were supposed to stay fragmented. It will not happen all at once. It never does. It will happen through accumulation, the same way wreckage accumulated around the giant. A blurred image posted online. A data set that does not quite fit existing models. A forum thread where people compare notes and realize they are not alone in what they have seen. Attention will return to the deep. And attention is pressure in the wrong direction. I am telling this now because I recognize the signs. The same way meteorologists recognize a storm before it forms. I see shipping lanes shifting again, this time not quietly enough. I see exploration projects accelerating instead of slowing. I see language changing from caution to opportunity. I see people preparing to look down for answers instead of up for weather. When the drowned giant rises, it will not feel like an invasion. That is the part I need people to understand. It will not come with sudden violence or spectacle. It will not announce itself with destruction the way disasters usually do. It will feel like release, like something long held in place finally being allowed to move. The ocean has been a restraint, not a habitat. Pressure has been a cage, not a condition. If that pressure changes enough, if attention alters the balance enough, the transition will not be dramatic at first. Ships will fail in ways that defy explanation. Water will move wrong more often. Sonar will return shapes that refuse classification. The environment will adjust around something that is no longer fully contained. People will argue about causes. They always do. Equipment failure, climate effects, rare geological events, anything but the truth, because the truth sounds like myth until it is too late to dismiss. I am writing this because someone needs to say we were warned. Not by prophecy, not by superstition, by patterns, by data, by rules that existed not to control behavior but to manage a reality too large to confront directly. We kept it drowned by staying quiet, by staying away, by pretending the deep was empty beyond what we could measure. That pretense is ending. I do not know what the drowned giant wants, if want is even the right word. I do not believe it thinks the way we think. I believe it responds to conditions, to pressure, to absence and presence, to being held and being noticed. Awareness changes environments. We learned that lesson the hard way. If you read this and feel a pull toward the deep, an urge to prove it wrong or right, understand that impulse is part of the problem. Curiosity is not neutral when directed at something held in place by neglect. The ocean does not forget. It accumulates. It records everything placed into it, whether intentionally or not. The giant beneath it has been accumulating the consequences of our activity for longer than we have been paying attention. I am not asking anyone to believe me. Belief is irrelevant. What matters is restraint, distance, the understanding that some things are kept stable not because they are harmless, but because we have learned, collectively and imperfectly, not to disturb them. When the pressure changes enough, when the deep becomes crowded with machines and eyes and questions, the drowned giant will not need to rise far to alter the world above it. It will simply shift, and the ocean will respond. I am telling this now because silence is no longer protection. It is delay, and delay is running out. If nothing else, let this stand as a record that someone saw the pattern forming and tried to name it before it became impossible to ignore. We were not guarding a secret. We were maintaining a balance. And balances fail quietly, right up until the moment they do not. The last message I received from the company arrived months after my exit paperwork cleared, long after I stopped checking my old secure channels out of habit. It came through a personal address I never remembered giving them, formatted simply, no logos, no signatures. For a moment, I considered deleting it unread. I did not. It was not a threat. There were no warnings about confidentiality or consequences, no reminders of contracts or non-disclosure clauses. It read more like a footnote than a demand, as if someone felt an obligation to close a loop rather than silence me. The ocean remembers everything placed into it. That was the opening line. The message went on to say that my departure had been processed as final, that my evaluations would not be contested, that I would not be contacted again. It thanked me, in language so neutral it almost felt sincere, for my contribution to maintaining operational stability. Then it ended with a reminder, framed as advice rather than instruction. The drowned giant is not a monster, it is a consequence. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Monsters imply intent, hunger, malice. The giant had never shown any of those things. It had existed, it had endured, it had responded to pressure and disturbance the way any massive system responds when stressed. The ocean remembers everything placed into it. Not just wreckage and waste and lost machines. It remembers roots, vibrations, repetition, the way human activity carved patterns into its depths long before we could see them clearly. The giant was not an intruder in that memory. It was part of it. A consequence of accumulation. The message ended with a final line that felt less like corporate language and more like resignation. When it wakes fully, salvage will no longer matter. Rules will not matter. Depth will not matter. I understood what that meant in a way I could not have while I was still working there. Salvage was effective only as long as the illusion held, as long as wrecks could be treated as anomalies, as long as attention could be redirected away from the deep. But the ocean does not forget. It returns what is placed into it eventually, reshaped by time and pressure, but never erased. The giant beneath it was not rising because it wanted to. It was responding to centuries of accumulation, to shipping lanes layered over each other, to drilling vibrations, to sonar mapping and deep-sea exploration, and the constant insistence that the ocean was empty until proven otherwise. We buried consequences in the deep and called it distance. When the message said the sea would return what we buried, including the truth, I knew it was not speaking metaphorically. Truth has mass. It exerts pressure. It displaces things when it surfaces. I think about that often now when I see news stories about new discoveries, about unprecedented deep-sea footage, about unmapped regions finally being rendered in high resolution. Each breakthrough celebrated as progress, each new image another layer of attention pressing downward. I do not see monsters in those images. I see reminders. The drowned giant is not waiting to attack. It is waiting for conditions to change enough that restraint becomes unnecessary. When that happens, the shift will not be dramatic at first. It will feel like correction, like the ocean rebalancing itself after centuries of strain. Salvage will no longer matter because there will be nothing left to erase. Too many records, too many witnesses, too much accumulated awareness to subtract cleanly. Rules will not matter because they were built for silence, not inevitability. Depth will not matter because pressure is not infinite. It only works until it does not. The sea will return what we buried in it. Wrecks will resurface in patterns that can no longer be explained away. Water will move in ways that ignore our models. The deep will stop being a place where consequences can be hidden simply by going far enough down. The truth will not come up screaming. It will rise the way pressure equalizes, slowly and relentlessly, until pretending it is not there becomes impossible. I keep the message saved, though I do not know why. Perhaps because it confirms what I already understood, that no one was truly in control, that the systems we built were always temporary. That silence was a delay, not a solution. The ocean remembers everything placed into it, including us, including the choices we made when we thought distance was the same as safety. When the drowned giant finally wakes fully, when the pressure holding it in place shifts beyond recovery, it will not be the beginning of something new. It will be the continuation of something we started a long time ago and never finished dealing with. And the sea will not ask permission to return what we left behind. It never does.